I'm your host, Annie Bowles, and this is a bonus episode of News du Jour. It is my pleasure to introduce today Erica Scott and Marcia Baczynski, co-authors of the book Creating Consent Culture. As a soon-to-be mother, educating my son about consent is something I've been marinating on for months. Erica and Marcia are both professionals in the space of consent and are coming on the podcast today to educate us a little bit, but also to tell us about their book where we can learn more. First of all, welcome to the podcast. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about where each of you is from and how you know each other?
So I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse, and I've had a lot of issues in my life because of that, around consent, around boundaries. My boundaries were really shattered as a young person. And I'm now in my mid-50s. When I was in my mid-40s, I had a health breakdown from all the stress in my life. And at that time, I wanted to do something more meaningful in my life. And I came across Marcia's work on consent. So Marcia co-founded, or should I let you tell that story?
You can go ahead.
Marcia co-founded a workshop, a touch and communication workshop called Cuddle Party 17 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I found that work, and the part about the thing party that affected me so deeply is that the beginning part of it, the welcome circle, is all about consent. It's all about learning the rules of consent, the rules of Cuddle Party, to help you have good interaction with everyone. And it really changed my life. And I became a Cuddle Party facilitator, and I really enjoyed all of it, but I really enjoyed that part where we were teaching people about consent. And so a few years ago, I asked Marcia, because I've found over the years that many people I thought could really benefit from that had told me they will never go to a cuddle party, even though it's a non-sexual event. It's just too intimidating for a lot of people. So I asked Marcia if we could take those same the consent education portion of it, expand it and modify it so that it could go out to a wider audience. And she said yes. And so I developed a workshop based on that. And then I was workshopping it in Honolulu, and it was going really well. And then I was on my first ever girl trip, and it just came to me during the trip that it should become a book. And so I got in touch with Marcia again and asked her if she would co-author the book with me. And that's how it happened.
Amazing.
And here we are.
Yeah. Well, Marcia, why don't you tell us about the same?
Yeah. So I came to this from a very different route than Erica. I grew up in a household that, while quite conservative in a lot of ways, my mom was a nurse, and she worked with kids in the foster care system. And she was just very invested in my brother and I having a sense of our own bodily autonomy, and having worked with kids for years who'd been abused, she was not interested in us having that experience. I mean, I think that's the case for most parents, but she was very
aware of it,
very on point about it. So, and there were things that happened to her when she was a kid, like she was had required to hug and kiss relatives that she didn't want to hug and kiss, and things like that I think really affected her philosophy of how she wanted to raise me and my brother. So I got this kind of embodied sense of it's okay to say no from a really young age. and so did my brother, and to ask and like negotiate and all that kind of stuff. I don't think my mom had any of this vocabulary. So I think that's an important thing, is that you don't have to know all the fancy terminology to teach this stuff to your kids. But as I got older, I was really interested in sex education, and I became a sex educator and was co-founded Cuddle Party in 2004, which was a non-sexual workshop about touch and communication and boundaries. And, hilariously, I was not much of a cuddler, but I am a giant communication nerd. So, as Erica mentioned, like the welcome circle, that sort of intro where we really force the rules are, if you're a no, say no. And if you're a maybe, say no. And if you're a yes, say yes. And it's okay to change your mind. Those things and the little exercises and games we played with people for years, I really saw a massive impact on people's lives. And I had also experienced the thing that Erica mentioned, where people would be intimidated by the idea of cuddling. Because it was really, I think it's really hard for people who've had their consent violated to believe you when you say, one of the rules is you do not have to cuddle anyone at a cuddle party. But people didn't believe us because they'd been pushed to do things they didn't want to do over and over again, which we can go into more later. But so when, Erica approached me about adapting some of these exercises, I was like, yep, go for it. And when she approached me about the book, I was like, oh, hell yeah. So we, and then the pandemic hit, and I was like, well, I'm not doing anything. Let's get this book written. So
perfect
and I
timing.
think it's been interesting in the context. Yeah, I think it's interesting in the context of COVID too, because people are having to have the kinds of consent conversations. Like, is it okay if how do you feel if will you please do this? Will you please do that? Oh, we have different risk tolerances. How are we going to navigate that? And so it's kind of very timely in that regard as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you frame it as somewhat of a communication issue as well, because I do think that during the pandemic, like you're describing, like how to talk to people about your comfort level was kind of the challenging aspect of it. And I guess that's what consent comes down to as well in general. So did either of you guys study anything similar to this, or anything that led into this when you were in school?
My major was public relations, which has turned out to be very handy on getting the word out. But I minored in history and had a certificate in women's studies. So I was very interested in school around the ways that gender is constructed historically, and how it changes to suit the times, and how also the manufacturing of consent is actually, there's a book called The Manufacturing of Consent, which is about propaganda and PR. So like I've been very interested in these topics from a lot of angles for a really long time. This like sort of the ways that culturally, why is green in season this color? Well, there's a whole campaign that people put on for various reasons about that. Or why is everybody suddenly talking about your carbon footprint? Well, that's because that was a whole push on the part of the petrochemical industry to like get the attention off of them and put the attention on individual actors. There's all these things that sort of are in the culture, and I was like, man, this stuff kind of happens to us and we don't really get a say, and it's gross. I want to do something against that. So I kind of went to school to learn how to manipulate people. That's not what I thought I was doing. I just thought I was like gonna do PR when I grew up. And then the more I like kind of got into the industry, or into learning about the industry, the more I was like, not only is this not what I want to do, I actually want to actively deconstruct it. Yeah. So sort of. Cool. It's not like therapy, or I took psychology and stuff, but it was really learning how we're constantly being manipulated by all kinds of forces around us that really got me into trying to counteract that.
Yeah, those phrases don't come out of nowhere. It's so true.
Nope.
What about you, Erica? What'd you study in school?
Yeah, I came at it more from a school of life perspective. I did go to university. I started to do a degree in biology, and then dropped out, and then I became an electrician.
Oh, cool.
So I worked in a male-dominated industry for a long time, and I had to work on my boundaries.
Yeah.
So that was part of it. And I also became a mom, and I'm now the mother of young adult children, and seeing what they were going through as well as part of what led to this. So for me, it was more like just life experience. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I did get my train the trainer certificate while we were writing the book.
Cool. So tell us a little bit about how you guys define consent culture, because I think that's just a good place to start. We have people of all different age groups listening in, so I love to keep that in mind, that like consent culture is to a certain extent a newer concept. So how do you guys define it?
So in the book, we have a really short definition, but it is hard to define it briefly. But what we did say is that consent culture is a culture which emphasizes collaboration to create the most mutually beneficial interactions possible. But Marcia's going to fill you in on how it's much more than that, because you really can't pin it down to something concise.
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, like, what is consent? And a lot of people think of consent as permission, which is a piece of consent, but it's not the whole picture. Really, consent is an agreement about how we're going to play together. It's like or share space or be together, you know? So, you know, there's that piece of it, but then there's also like the culture piece. It's like, what is culture? And one of the epiphanies I kind of had is that all of us have the opportunity to build the culture around us. Like, we can look at the bigger world and maybe feel dismayed about some of the circumstances or things we see, or, oh, it feels like there's all these things that are beyond my control and my power. But every family, every school, every group of friends, every work environment, we can influence the people around us. And we can create, in the book, we talk about creating warm, safe havens for people where, you know, we listen, we ask questions, we don't jump to the action before we're clear about where everybody's at. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's a lot of what creating consent culture is about, is shifting from a culture of coercion, which our dominant culture is very coercive, because we just want to move things along and we just want to get what we want. And like I kind of alluded to earlier, there's sort of also some, you know, business interests on just getting people to do things. And so when we slow down and we pay attention to one another and we get into relationship with one another, that's creating culture. That is, you know, we can affect the vibe around us basically by just moving a little bit slower, listening a little bit more, asking, being able to hear no, being able to say no, having boundaries, practicing our boundaries, encouraging other people to have boundaries. Mm-hmm. Those are all acts of culture making. And I think that we all have the power to do that. And so creating consent culture was very much a conscious choice on our part in terms of what we're trying to do, because it's incremental and it's not overnight, and but we all have the power to do it. So that's kind of I think really cool.
It's ongoing. And Marcia was talking about the old permissive model, where there's this script, there's this idea that one person asks for something and the other person says yes or no. But what we talk about in the book is how consent is collaboration. Mm-hmm. Everyone involved needs to be asking for what they want. So there are these skills that come into play that a lot of us struggle with because we have grown up in this coercive culture. So most people struggle with saying no. Most people struggle with hearing no gracefully. Mm-hmm. Most people struggle with asking for what they want in a clear way. And these are all essential skills to be able to have that good collaboration. So, yeah. So basically what we do in the book is we show how to lead exercises, fun, interactive exercises that will work with anyone from the age 10 and up. And these exercises teach those skills in an embodied way, and more than what I just said. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because the book, as Erica said, we're really teaching people how to teach consent in a way that's actually fun and embodied. I think one of the sort of pitfalls we've seen is that when people teach consent, there's kind of two pitfalls, really. One is it's all very about avoiding the bad things from happening, avoiding sexual assault, avoiding ending sexual violence. It's very frequently in the context of sex exclusively. And then the other sort of mistake that I think a lot of people make is that it's not embodied. And the fact of the matter is we have to practice the skill. You have to know what no feels like in your body, and then be able to connect it up with your mouth to say the words. And, there's nothing wrong with discussion. Discussion's great. And obviously we are pro ending sexual violence. It's just that there's a kind of a cooler world available to us when we are being more collaborative. Yeah. And we're not afraid of, like you mentioned, the push-pull doesn't necessarily mean there's a conflict.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like that we can disagree or want different things. And it doesn't mean that what you wanted was bad or wrong. And kind of normalizing the idea that mismatched desire is fine. And we can still find a place that we want to play together if we want to play together for, whether that's at work or in a relationship or, literally playing on the playground if in the case of little kids. So I think that kind of practicing these skills in a way that is, the exercises in the book are really fun. People usually crack up. They're silly. But it's also like, oh, I see how I do this thing. I see how everybody around me does this thing. That's kind of, and there's no shame in it, right? Because they're just people being people.
Yeah. Well, tell us about what you feel like from your experiences working in this space. What is one of the biggest misconceptions about consent?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I was like, ooh, I want this one.
Yeah.
So we kind of alluded to this already. I think there's a few big misconceptions. One is that it's permission. And permission is a piece of consent. Sometimes it is as simple as, hey, can I have that cookie? Yeah, sure, go ahead. That's a consent conversation. But this idea, especially in the sort of sexual realm, of what I call the gatekeeper model of one person, the woman, has the sex and another person, the man, is supposed to try to get the sex. And there's so many things wrong with this model. The man is always supposed to want sex. The woman is only allowed to say yes or no. It's very heteronormative. There's so many things that are problematic about this worldview. And the truth is with consent, both people need to be able to ask for what they want, and both people need to be able to say yes and no and navigate their maybes. And those are skills that serve us everywhere in life. So that whole gatekeeper model, I think, is a big. It's my little hobby horse. Erica, do you want to jump on?
Yeah. I really like that you talked about navigating a maybe, because I think that is a big piece for a lot of people, and especially young people who are just starting to explore what they want and who they are in the world. And one of the things that helps me a lot in these rules is if you're a maybe, say no. Defaulting to no when you're a maybe gives you space to figure out what you really want, for what you actually want. And I just think, for me, that changed my life, using that rule. So we talk about changing your mind and how it's okay to change your mind anytime when it comes to your bodily autonomy. Because I think a lot of there is a script as well that, once you get to a certain point, you're not supposed to change your mind. There's just so many. Sorry, what was the question again?
Misconceptions about consent.
Well, and then also too that it's all about sex. Consent is a part of every interaction, and this is how we teach our kids, right from the get-go, teaching them about their bodily autonomy and consent from in non-sexual contexts from the time they're little. And so we're building on this. Our thing is designed for age 10 and up, just because if kids are younger than that, I think they would be bored. They need more like songs, games, and that. So, but it's still fun. And yeah, like Marcia said, it cracks people. The exercises and really games crack people up as well as make you think. You know, when you're laughing, you're learning and you're remembering. And especially when things are interactive as well, it's just that much more effective. When we feel these things in our bodies, when we feel what it feels like to say no and have that no honored, we're going to notice then when we come into the world and someone doesn't honor our no, we're going to notice the difference and be like, oh, that didn't feel good. And I know how it's supposed to feel. So yeah.
I love that, because actually my next question for you guys was how to lay a foundation for kids. And what I mean by that, I think, is just, you know, when they're too young to really talk about in direct terms, how can you sort of introduce those concepts? And you definitely touched on that, but do you have anything to add to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really important to recognize about ourselves and our lived experience, as well as if you are a parent or a caregiver of young children, especially really young children, is that every single one of us, even under the best of circumstances, learned how to go along with things happening to our bodies that we didn't want before we could ever talk. So it's in there, that tolerating, the enduring, the going along with. Yeah. Even if your parents were like super caring and loving and not remotely abusive, you still got picked up when you didn't want to be. You still got your diaper changed when you didn't want to. You still went to the bed when you didn't want to. Like those things happen. So we learn to tolerate things before we can ever talk. And so some of this is and that's why also when kids learn to talk, one of the first things they figure out how to say is no, because they've been dealing with this for 2 years and now I can say something, you know? So I think it's really important for people to understand that consent culture is not just letting kids do whatever they want. Right. It's explaining why you're doing things, giving context, giving more information. It's giving little kids a choice as often as is reasonable. You know, and it's not having boundaries. It's not letting them run roughshod all over you. It's letting them know that their bodily autonomy matters, and that even if you can't always, you know, they're just like, you're gonna grab your kid out of traffic, like you just are. Like that's your job as a parent, is to keep your kids safe. Yeah. At the same time, in situations where there's not a threat, in situations where, you know, it is reasonable to give kids a choice about their body, doing that and giving them the opportunity to notice and to like help them understand their feelings about, you know, it seems like you're upset.
Involving the other adults in their lives, your friends and family, and telling them what you're doing and that you would like them to also respect your child's bodily autonomy as much as possible. For instance, at family gatherings and whatever, if the child doesn't want a hug, then not try to guilt them into giving one, or to, you know, leave it up to the child to decide.
Thank you so much. So for our next question, when do you recommend talking more directly about sexual consent with your kids?
So there's an idea, I think, that sexual consent is somehow different than regular consent. And I think there's also this idea that there's a talk, right? There's the talk. And my philosophy about sex education is, if the kid's old enough to ask a question, the kid is old enough to get an age-appropriate, accurate answer. So as far as talking about sex, you know, when they're little, you name body parts, you teach them the correct names for body parts, and you teach them about, you know, respecting, like, she said no, he said no, like, listen, like teaching them to listen to other kids. Now, little kids are kind of sociopaths. They don't have the brains developed yet to like fully have empathy and all of that. So that's that's an ongoing process. As far as talking about sexual consent, if you're laying the foundation of consent more generally, the asking for what you want, the teaching your kids how to hear a no without making them wrong for having asked, teaching your kids to say no, teaching your kids that it's okay to change their mind. Also, something we haven't said yet is backing them up and believing them when they bring something to you. Or they don't like that doctor, or they don't like that something feels off about that relative. Just being like, okay, like, I don't know if your story is exactly the true story, but I'm going to believe that there's something there that I need to pay attention to. Yeah. These things build the foundation so that by the time you get to a conversation about sexual consent, it's going to make more sense to them, because it's not going to be out of the ordinary from what you've already been doing, which is talking about medically accurate, hopefully pleasure is a good thing, sexuality, and then also, all of these other consent things in the rest of their lives, and these relationship, and they're basically relationship and communication skills. So I think there's an age at which, and it'll depend on the kid, but it'll come up because you'll watch a movie with the kid, and there'll be some, like, maybe it's their first PG-13 or R movie, and something comes up and you're like, oh, let's talk about what we saw in that film. Like, do you think it was, like, what do you think about the way those characters handled that thing? Like, that's a way to have a sexual consent conversation. Because there's so much rape and sexual assault and stalking in all of our films. It's pretty easy to find, ins for that using media.
And then when you get to the more sexual conversations, you'll already have that kind of dynamic. Yeah.
I also want to piggyback on the modeling thing too. One of the pieces of consent culture that we talk about later in the book, and I think this is really not discussed enough, is what do you do when something goes wrong? And as a parent, apologizing to your kids when you screw up with them is a fantastic way to model taking accountability and, like, responsibility. And, hey, I did this to you and it wasn't okay, is a really powerful piece of consent modeling, where it's like, oh, apologizing, I'm going to be immediately punished or shunned or what have you. I can actually, make repair in my relationships, because that's a piece of consent is, especially with young people, but even working with the adults I work with, we make mistakes. Not everything is an intentional sadistic violation. There are just misunderstandings that happen, and ouch, and that didn't feel good, and you didn't listen to me. Those things happen too, and those are, you can call them whatever you want, consent incidents. But modeling apologizing and taking responsibility and trying to make repair when you do cross your kids' boundaries, profound, I think, in terms of building consent culture.
Wow, I love that. And again, it's bringing up so many different things in my brain, because I nannied for 5 years while I was starting up this business, and I nannied younger than school age kids. And so this is giving a lot of perspective for me on, sometimes there's a little boy who comes to mind who didn't like to get kissed. And he would say, only mommy and teddy bears can kiss me. And I just thought that was just the sweetest thing. But it's like, of course, I was someone who would just automatically honor that. But I think, there's probably people who are like, oh, he's 2, like, he doesn't know what he's talking, So that's very interesting that all of that builds on itself from a young age. Hey guys, so I hate to say it, but unfortunately, the last part of that conversation, it was under 5 minutes, was lost, and it's killing me because I think the last question was a good one, but I hope that what you heard today gives you a better understanding of what consent really is, how it functions in our day-to-day lives outside of a sexual context. And I hope that you guys will continue learning about consent
reading their book is a great place to start, but I'm also going to go ahead and link, their Instagram handles and contact information in our show notes today. So you can buy their book, you can follow them online, etc. So that way these two women can continue to help educate us so that we can practice consent in our day-to-day lives and raise kids who will do the same. So thank you for listening, and apologies about the ending here. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of our podcast. For $7.99 a month, you can unlock tons of perks like breaking news text messages so that you're never out of the loop. Tons of bonus episodes are already up there ready for you to binge, and a discussion board full of networking opportunities and much more. Go to www.patreon.com/sugarfree media today to become a patron. This is the best way to support our show. Our patrons make News du Jour possible. But a couple other ways to support our podcast are rate and review on whatever podcast platform you use to listen, share on your social media, you have influence, tell your friends, family, and colleagues that you love News du Jour and why you listen. You can also follow us on social media under sugarfreemedia.co on Instagram, just sugarfreemedia, all one word, on TikTok, and sugarfree_media on Twitter. We also have a weekend newsletter called Dreamers Digest that's full of dreamy content recommendations for your weekend and a life update from yours truly. Sign up today on our website, www.sugarfreemedia.co. Our music is by Joey Lavoie and Nicholas Foster. Our cover art is by Hannah Pierce Photography. Our Sugar Free Media logo is by Catherine Jezik Designs. Any twinkling or little footsteps you might hear in the background are by my dog, Rhett. He's a rescue pup and always records with me. We appreciate you listening and look forward to telling you about the news again next time on News du Jour. Broadcasting from Oklahoma.